Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds. Hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, we are going to continue our United States history series by looking at the Vietnam War era. Don't forget that there's a link for a fill-in-the-blanks worksheet in the description. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize for any mispronunciations ahead of time. I do my best. Okay, let's go. The Cold War and Vietnam President Kennedy was all about beefing up the military. Think of it like upgrading from dial-up to high-speed internet, but with missiles. He pushed for a flexible response defense plan, preparing the U.S. to handle conflicts of any size, from bar fights to all-out world wars. And he had one major goal: to stop communism from spreading like a bad rumor, especially in poorer nations. His first big test? Cuba. Fidel Castro took over in 1959, quickly buddying up with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower had previously drafted a plan to give Castro the boot, and Kennedy decided to go for it in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs invasion. But, as if named by a clairvoyant, the invasion was a fiasco that probably made Castro look even more powerful. Then things got spicy when the Soviets started building nuclear missile sites in Cuba, putting them way too close to American soil for Kennedy's comfort. Enter the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy told the Soviets to pack up their missiles and go home. For a few tense days, the world held its breath, but thankfully Khrushchev blinked, the missiles were removed, and the two leaders installed a hotline phone system, kind of like an international red alert phone. Next up, Berlin. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev tried to pressure Kennedy to pull American troops out of West Berlin, but Kennedy wasn't having it. In response, Khrushchev built the Berlin Wall, a concrete symbol of the whole East versus West drama. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, things had been heating up since the French had been holding on to it like an old coat they wouldn't give up. Ho Chi Minh, who had been fighting for independence forever, wasn't just in it for freedom. He was in it for communism, with a little help from his Soviet pals. The US had its reasons for getting involved: to keep France happy as an ally, and to prevent the dreaded domino effect, the idea that if Vietnam fell to communism, the whole region would topple. So through the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, CTO, the US began sending money, and then, with Kennedy at the helm in 1961, troops to South Vietnam. After North Vietnam attacked a US destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin, President Johnson amped up the involvement. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which let Johnson throw American troops into the mix without the formal "we're going to war" declaration. It was like getting a blank check to go all in, and the US would be deeply entangled in Vietnam for years to come. America's role escalates. In February 1965, President Johnson doubled down in Vietnam with a plan that sounded more like a rock concert than a military strategy: Operation Rolling Thunder. The idea was to bomb the North Vietnamese so heavily they'd be too rattled to keep fighting. But despite all the firepower, the communists just wouldn't quit. So Johnson followed up with the classic, if at first you don't succeed, send more troops approach, thanks to advice from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and General William Westmoreland. Along with conventional bombs, American pilots started dropping napalm, a fiery substance that sticks and spreads like hot glue gone rogue. They also sprayed Agent Orange, an herbicide that turned the jungle into a wasteland, partly to starve out the enemy. But even with all this, US troops didn't face big battles. Instead, they were dodging guerrilla tactics in dense jungles. The Viet Cong, sticking to Ho Chi Minh's strategy of never fighting on the enemy's terms, specialized in sneak attacks, night ambushes, and booby traps, making it nearly impossible for US soldiers to tell who was friend or foe. By 1967, the war had ground to a frustrating stalemate, and by 1968, the toll was sobering. Over 30,000 American soldiers lost, with little ground gained. Despite Johnson's hopeful pep talks, the war effort wasn't showing real progress, and troops' morale was slipping fast. The price tag for the war kept ballooning, stretching the government's budget thin. Sure, all that spending cut unemployment back home, but it also sent prices and inflation through the roof. To keep up, Johnson raised taxes and cut back on social programs, a decision as popular as, well, the war itself. By this point, Congress was split into two camps. the hawks, who saw the war as a noble battle against communism, and the doves, who thought the whole thing was morally and strategically dubious. The doves weren't so sure Vietnam was the hill democracy needed to die on. And thus, the debate continued, echoing back home in protests, disagreements, and a growing sense of, why are we even here? The anti-war movement. The Vietnam War didn't just divide Americans, it tore open an emotional canyon in American society. To keep the ranks filled, the government turned to the draft, which selected young men for service, though some thought the process was about as fair as drawing names from a hat. Draft boards handed out deferments like backstage passes to college students and certain workers, meaning those called up to fight often came from working class and poor backgrounds. And for African Americans, the odds of landing in Vietnam were even higher. College campuses became the beating heart of anti-war sentiment. The Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, a group originally formed to fight racism and poverty, soon became a major anti-war player. Protests led to clashes with police, and the nightly news served up a steady stream of war footage that made the government's rosy reports look pretty suspicious. This credibility gap had people wondering if officials were watching the same war. When the Tet Offensive hit, it was a shock to the system. This large-scale attack by the North Vietnamese showed that the enemy wasn't close to giving up. Although the U.S. managed to push back the offensive, it crushed the idea of a quick victory. Amidst the chaos, the 1968 election campaign kicked off. Senator Eugene McCarthy threw his hat in the ring as an anti-war Democrat, making an unexpectedly strong showing in the primaries. Robert Kennedy also jumped into the race, while Johnson shocked everyone by announcing he wouldn't run for another term. As if things weren't heated enough, the spring and summer of 1968 turned violent at home. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Then Robert Kennedy was killed just after winning the California primary. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago descended into chaos as police clashed with anti-war protesters, a scene that only boosted Republican Richard Nixon's chances. Promising peace with honor in Vietnam, Nixon took the presidency that November, inheriting a deeply divided country. The war's end and its effects. When Nixon took office, he was optimistic that a peace deal with North Vietnam was just around the corner. But when negotiations hit a brick wall, Nixon started easing American troops out of Vietnam. His plan, called Vietnamization, was to hand over the reins to the South Vietnamese army, essentially saying, "You've got this," while sending them supplies and a pep talk to hold their ground. Then in 1970, Nixon unexpectedly ordered a ground attack on communist forces in Cambodia. This move had anti-war activists in the U.S. shouting, "Wait, wasn't this supposed to be less war?" Protests exploded across college campuses, and tragedy struck at Kent State University, where National Guard troops fired on protesters, killing 4 students. Protests spread to other campuses, including Jackson State in Mississippi, where 2 more students were killed, fueling national outrage. Adding to the anger, news broke of a horrific incident in the Vietnamese village of My Lai, where American troops killed more than 400 unarmed civilians. And just when trust couldn't sink any lower, the Pentagon Papers leaked, showing the government had been fudging facts about the war all along. Finally, after more bombing, the North Vietnamese returned to the table, and in January 1973, the U.S., South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords. America was officially out, but North Vietnamese troops stayed put in the South. The U.S. went home, but the war wasn't really over. Soon, the Soviet-backed North Vietnamese overran the South, uniting Vietnam under communist rule. By the end, the Vietnam War had cost over 58,000 American lives and more than 2 million Vietnamese lives. The fallout rattled Southeast Asia for years and left Americans with a case of never again. Congress responded by passing the War Powers Act in 1973, putting new limits on the president's ability to send troops overseas. The ghost of Vietnam would haunt U.S. foreign policy for decades, as Americans became wary of diving into conflicts without a clear exit in sight. The end of this is in sight, but let's recap first. The Vietnam War was a whirlwind of escalating U.S. involvement, from Kennedy's military buildup to Johnson's all-in commitment and Nixon's attempt at a peace with honor exit. Kennedy initially aimed to contain communism worldwide, starting with Cuba and then Vietnam. After North Vietnam attacked a U.S. destroyer, Johnson ramped up U.S. military action, leading to intense bombings and guerrilla warfare that wore down American morale. The war became a point of deep division in the U.S., sparking widespread anti-war protests, especially on college campuses, and a credibility gap between the government's reports and the grim reality on the ground. Nixon eventually reduced troop numbers, aiming for South Vietnam to stand alone, but his expansion of the war into Cambodia and the My Lai massacre fueled public anger. Finally, after the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, the U.S. withdrew, leaving South Vietnam vulnerable to a full communist takeover. The conflict cost thousands of American and millions of Vietnamese lives, straining public trust in the government and setting a more cautious tone for future U.S. foreign policy. There you have it, folks. That is the Vietnam War era nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Please remember to hit those like and subscribe buttons hard for me. Do you think that we should have gotten involved in Vietnam? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.